We're back tonight on In Focus. Some observers are concerned that the spiraling food prices and rising cost of living is becoming a threat to national security. Among them is Managing Director of FoodForward South Africa, Andy du Plessis, who joins us now to tell us more. Andy, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and for joining us here on In Focus once again. Others will look at inflation and say, yeah, I hear that it's reported that South Africa is inflation has breached the 6% ceiling, but where I'm sitting, it's actually even further than that. I'm probably looking at a much higher inflation than what is reported, I suppose, generally on average. How far higher are food surging today than they were in 2021?
Thank you, Tabo, for having us. Yeah, so while we are seeing an uptick in inflation in general, I think when you isolate food price inflation and you look at a food basket of basic food ingredients, we have found with our year-on-year price comparison, and our price comparison involves close to 150 basic grocery items being priced at two different retailers year-on-year at the same during the same month, 1 year apart. And we have found a staggering 12.9% increase in food prices. We have seen cereals increase by 23%. Fruit has increased fruit prices by 62%. Vegetables close to 10%. Grains just over 12.2%. So what we are finding that food price inflation is just running way ahead of where consumers are able to keep up with. And that does mean that the poor are worst affected. And because the poor are unable to secure basic nutritious goods, they are eating unhealthy foods which have detrimental consequences for themselves, for our labor force, and for the country and our economy.
Yeah. How does this limit access to food for the various households?
So South Africa produces enough food for all its people, but we have issues around accessibility and affordability. So when you look at the National Income Dynamics Study report, they've shown that over a study of just over 7,500 people during the month of May 2021, they found that for at least 1 week or 2 weeks in a particular month, people are going without food because they don't have the money to buy food. As you are aware, unemployment has increased to a staggering 35%. But when you look at the broad definition of unemployment, we're closer to 45%. Youth unemployment is sitting at 63%. So we find ourselves in a situation where people just don't have jobs, and basic households where there are 6, 8, 10 people living in a home just can't survive on social grants. In South Africa, we got more people on social grants than we have in the formal employment market, and people just don't have the money to buy food. In the Eastern Cape earlier, at the beginning of this year, we received reports that 12 children died of malnutrition. And South Africa has the highest rate of stunting in the world, where children up to the age of 5, roughly 30% of them are reporting to be underweight for their age, which is hugely problematic for South Africa.
Now, as the world, the globe braces itself for economic recession, how geared are we, how well positioned are we to be able to soften the blow?
So sad to say, we just, unfortunately, we are not. Our estimates are that roughly 30 million people are experiencing food security at some time during the month, 1 week or 2 weeks during a month, and they just don't have the ability to absorb those kind of shocks. Most of our people are living on social grants, which research has shown last for about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at a stretch if you are able to survive. So we are not able to survive those kind of shocks. What we are in is in a state of crisis in terms of food availability and food affordability for roughly half of South Africa. So when you look at the middle class, we're finding that, and research is showing that even the middle class is struggling, and where middle class homes where there were 2 incomes and one has lost their income, they are now also reliant on social assistance and food support. So we are finding that it's trickling down, and we are not in a position to handle these shocks. We need to make sure that we address the accessibility of food to the majority of South Africans.
Yeah. We're watching pictures of coming out of Sri Lanka now, and what has happened there. I mean, it's largely driven by rising fuel costs and rising food prices. How real is a risk of social instability?
So the Carnegie Institute has listed South Africa as one of 25 countries that are high risk for social instability and social disintegration. The World Economic Forum, the Global Risk Report, has isolated South Africa as one of the top 5 countries in the world at a high risk of political instability and social unrest. And what we found was that the July riots, although it was principally concentrated in KZN and sparked mostly because of political interferences, we are understanding that when the right levers are applied in underserved communities, that things can change drastically. And with so many people sitting at home, frustrated, not able to provide for themselves and their families, unable to earn an income, we will find that once those correct levers are applied, we could find ourselves in a national situation similar to what happened in July 2021 in KZN.
So you feel there is a relatively untapped opportunity in terms of what we can do as far as edible food supplies. Just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So in South Africa, around 1/3 of all the food that is produced throughout our supply chain is lost or wasted. That's equivalent of 10 million tons according to the CSIR technical report on food loss and waste. So 10 million tons of food is a substantial amount of food, which allows you, if you took just 50% of that volume, we could feed the 30 million people 2 meals a day for a whole year. Every single year with that food loss and waste. So throughout the food supply chain, starting with farmers, producers, manufacturers, and retailers, throughout the supply chain, there are inevitably supply chain weaknesses, supply chain disruptions. We're finding now with the SARS strike at the ports, huge amounts of things just can't go through the ports, and whether it's fresh produce or short-dated items that are sitting at the ports, those will have to be discarded. And what we do as an organization at FoodForward SA is we engage with those supply chain actors throughout the supply chain, and instead of them dumping and incinerating that stock that is still good for human consumption, those products that are within date and there's nothing wrong with the taste of the product or the feasibility and food safety of the product, we receive those food surpluses from our supply chain partners, and we use that model to address food insecurity. Now, when you use that model, our cost per meal is just a mere 68 cents. That's what it costs us to be able to facilitate the delivery of one meal, and that rolled out across the country, we can achieve economies of scale. What we do need is supply chain actors that are willing to, instead of dumping and incinerating that stock, which has a negative impact on our environment, and it costs them millions of rands to dispose of those goods, donate those goods to FoodForward SA. We have a network of just over 2,500 registered non-profit organizations that reach close to 1 million people on a daily basis, making sure that there's at least one nutritious meal per day. Just out of interest, that food surplus that we collect, more than 95% of that food is nutritious food. So, there's a model here that's worth considering.
Is there action that government will take here? I mean, 30 million people being fed 2 meals a day for a whole year at only 68 cents. That sounds like something that maybe even government would need to take some action to, enforce that those companies do provide this food without dumping it?
Absolutely, and we've put together a piece of draft legislation which we are lobbying government to consider around surplus food donations. And our view is that government does not have the funds to procure food and feed 30 million people a day. There's just not enough money in our country to be able to sustain that kind of program and initiative. And we're trying to convince government to put in place a piece of legislation that regulates surplus food donations. So we are not advocating to give people rotten food, expired food. We are talking about edible, quality food that is within date, that's in the supply chain, and instead of that food being incinerated and dumped in landfill, we are saying let's recover and intercept that food at the right time. But government needs to adopt this legislation and create this enabling environment throughout the supply chain so that we can fast track this. We have countries like France and Italy that has adopted this kind of legislation, and they've made it against the law to dump and incinerate stuff. And we are saying that South Africa needs to follow this route for two reasons. One, we have enough food in the country. We have a growing population of people that are food insecure. We have high rates of malnutrition in the world, and we have a model that works.
Andy, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and for bringing us that update. That's Andy, the Managing Director for FoodForward South Africa. Some suggestions there of what can be done to ensure that the food-starved communities of South Africa are fed a meal at least twice a day.